I wrote the lead story for the print edition that hopefully you have in your hands right now, and you should take a few, and you should give them to people, and you should give us money because we're awesome, and we want to do more of this work and do more of these events. We have, I'm sorry, say that again? Oh, there are a lot.
I can tell you, like,
a lot of bookstores around the city.
They're in the paper, they're on the second page.
So there's no boxes?
There's 40.
So I'll introduce our panel here. We've got a bunch of smart cookies to talk about rent control in San Francisco, perhaps the Bay Area in general. So first off, we have Deepa Varma, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Tenants Union. We have Peter Reitz, Executive Director of the Small Property Owners of San Francisco Institute. Sorry, there are people. And then we have David Garcia, who is the Policy Director of the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. So, the housing crisis, what is it? Actually, I won't read you the names of the reports, but suffice it to say that some good studies have been done recently talking about how about a quarter of renters statewide are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs, right? And another quarter paying more than 50% of their incomes on housing costs. More than 30% is considered being overburdened by housing costs. So this is a big problem, and if you want to see the results of it, just step outside in San Francisco anywhere. And we've got, the most recent official count was 7,500 people who are homeless in San Francisco, but the number could be more than twice as high. I'm being told, drop it down, drop it down. You don't want to hear all my mouth sounds? So what's really important to know about the homeless population in San Francisco and why it's relevant here is that about 70% of them, based on survey studies, about 70% of them became homeless once they got here, right? They weren't homeless and then arrived. They were here, they were paying rent, they were housed, and for whatever reason, you know, job falls through, income falls through, now they're on the streets, right? So this is something that we all face, and there are a lot of major consequences. We're here today talking about rent control because that's one of the potential policies that cities can use. But a state law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which you'll probably memorize pretty soon, that state law constrains what local governments can craft in terms of rent control policies. Now, we'll go through all of those constraints, I'm guessing, but suffice it to say that this November, Costa-Hawkins is on the chopping block, and that's why we're talking here. So, instead of getting into long, broad debates about whether the repeal of Costa-Hawkins will have negative or positive effects on the economy and the housing market in general, I'm hoping that we can talk about specific types of rent control that aren't available now, but will become available if Costa-Hawkins falls, and whether that would benefit San Francisco. So we're going to start with Deepa. Deepa, I'm curious, in San Francisco, do we have the type of rent control that we want, or do we want to change it? And if so, then how?
Hi everybody, thanks for being here. We definitely need stronger rent control. We can see it every day. Tenants are terrified. I don't know, how many people in the audience are tenants? And how many people who are tenants in San Francisco are scared of losing their homes? I can raise my own hand to that too. We need stronger protections. And what those protections are going to look like are going to depend on whether we win in November and the conversation we have with folks like this gentleman right here, with the apartment association, small property owners, other organizers in the community, and homeowners. We're going to have to come together and come up with a solution for this because it's a crisis. Our colleagues in Southern California report now, they've done a study that with every 5% rent increase in LA, there's another 2,000 homeless households. And we know in San Francisco that 70% of the homeless folks here were housed in San Francisco immediately before they became homeless. This is a crisis at the low end, and we know it's a crisis for the middle as well. It's a crisis in the school district. It's a crisis in the health sector. It's a crisis in the service sector. It's a crisis for the labor, for our brothers and sisters in the labor movement. It's a crisis in terms of city workers. It's reaching so far now that we really need to do something about it.
So how would you change it?
The way I would change it is not necessarily the way that it's, I mean, like I said before, it's going to wind up being a compromise based on what we can actually pass. Personally, I think we need to update our law to include much of the housing that's been built in the last 40 years. Costa-Hawkins restricts all of that from being rent controlled. Anything that's already been built is not going to... So people talk about this argument that rent control is going to restrict supply. That's not going to be true of anything that's already been built. Things that have already been built, in my opinion, should come under rent control. For things going forward, it's going to depend on what makes sense under market conditions when we win. And then I believe that there's no reason that single-family homes shouldn't be under rent control. And the reason is, single-family homes are rentals just like every other rental. They're not actually different in terms of who owns those buildings anymore. At this point, 37% of the rental housing in California are single-family homes. That's a huge percentage of the units. And it's a huge percentage in many, many rental housing units here in San Francisco that are single-family. I just talked to a tenant yesterday who lives in a single-family home who is about to be pushed out with his entire family, and he cried to me on the phone talking about how he didn't know where he was going to go next. Many, many single-family home rentals are of low-income people, are of immigrants, are of students, and are of households that should have the same protections as everybody else here in San Francisco. And more of those units are owned by corporate landlords and not by mom and pops. We do care about mom and pop landlords. Mom and pop landlords should be able to make a living, and luckily they're protected under state law already. Through there is a state law that says that landlords are entitled to a reasonable rate of return, and we're not trying to do away with that. We're just trying to do away with Costa-Hawkins. And then the third thing, of course, is vacancy control. Right now, the longer a tenant lives in their home, the more and more of a target is on their back in terms of how much a landlord has an incentive to evict them. We want to take that incentive away, make sure that that unit remains affordable for the next tenant. This is particularly a problem in situations where there's a tenant where there's a family and the person on the lease dies, and then everyone else in the household, instead of being able to have the chance to grieve the loss of their loved one, gets served an eviction notice. We've heard about that happening within a week of learning of the master dad dying. That we see cases like that every week at the San Francisco Tenants Union, and every agency in town sees that as well.
Can we talk to Peter now?
All right.
Peter, go ahead and take the mic.
That's fine. Well, thank you for inviting us. This subject, of course, is so vast, and you hardly know where to begin. Do you begin by talking specifically about the Costa-Hawkins law and repealing it? Or do you talk about government policies over the past 35 years? Do you talk about the recent laws that have been passed, I say recent, the last 15 years, that allow neighborhoods to block projects? That wasn't the case before. You can have a housing plan for your city, and when a specific project comes up, the neighborhoods block it, the NIMBY business. So you just really don't know where to get started. But on the in terms of, I can give some examples of government policies maybe later on. You can call on me to give one. But for the time being, I'll stick to just Costa-Hawkins. The previous panel outlined that 17,000 units are possibly off the market by choice. We use a figure, it's a couple thousand less, but it's a lot. Of the 31,000 units or 32,000 that are vacant at the current time, 6,500 or 6,800 or something, it's in this pie chart in the article, are secondary homes of people who have the pied-à-terre in San Francisco. And so there are various reasons, and there are others being rehabilitated and so forth, but there are an awful lot of units off the market by choice. Now why? Because they've had problems, they've been sued. There are, I agree that professional scammers, the renters that are scammers, are few in number. But by God, when you're sued and you have a $100,000 bill, that resonates throughout the entire community and people are running scared. And I'll tell you about another one when you call on me again about government policy that prevents all of this. If Costa-Hawkins passes, there will be a flight from a rental property. People will get out of the rental business, they'll sell as a TIC, they'll do what they can, and in my case, of course, I have some property down the coast in San Luis Obispo. I would never build another place or buy another place in San Francisco. I mean, that's out of the question. You just have so many problems, and they are government created. They're not landlord created, they're not tenant created, they're government created. The policies over 35 years that have punished the property owners. So if you repeal Costa-Hawkins, fine. I know it's just a repeal. It doesn't mean that you're establishing new laws. It opens the gateway to establish new laws, but at the moment the question is repealing. There will be fear in the rental property community, and we will continue to lose rental properties. I hope my colleague next to me will mention that the Terner report outlined how many units have been lost because of rent control. There is a negative side to rent control. Now,
Peter, I have some questions for you, if it's okay.
Yes.
We could have a bit more of a back and forth here between you guys, because we don't often get somebody who represents tenants and somebody who represents landlords sitting on stage together, able to have a rapport. Dave, we're going to get to you in just a second. Really sorry.
We'll be here all night.
We might be. There are a lot of great bars in the Mission District. So,
well, yes, that's one of the reasons, but remember that property values and property costs have increased a lot faster than just the CPI rate. You might have seen the Heather Knight article in the paper this very week, that it now costs $750,000 to build a low-cost, affordable unit, 17% more than last year. And she documents that with all kind of building statistics in the Chronicle. And the sale of affordable housing is at the rate of subsidized. Each one of these 750,000 units would be subsidized at about $343,000. Well, of course, that's passed on to, you make up a little bit through density, of course, but you also pass on the difference to the market rate units. So a poor person coming into this city, buying their house for the first time, pays an outrageous price because, of course, land is so expensive here. And then you have to pay a percentage for a subsidized unit for somebody else. So it makes it, all of these things are problems. So your costs are high, and people do sell, you know, people don't own rental apartments forever. The average time period is about 13 years.
So if vacancy control is off the table for you,
absolutely, that's not going to happen.
But single-family homes, rent control on single-family homes, and I want to give the mic back to Deepa for a second here. If rent control on single-family homes and on new buildings, or at least buildings that have been created since 1979, if that's on the table, then Deepa, how does that make you feel about your odds?
It sounds like it's time to repeal Costa-Hawkins, because that prevents all three of these, and we can at least start talking about what we need to do differently.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Peter, would you mind passing the mic over to David? I'm just curious for his take on this, because he has a lot of conversations with stakeholders from, you know, various different quarters that are off the record. I know because he and I have talked about this a bit, and I'm wondering, David, how do the conversations go between these people who at least publicly disagree? Do they disagree to the same extent in those backroom conversations?
So that's a really good question, and I would say that publicly you see a lot of stakeholders who, especially now that we have a Proposition 10 on the ballot, they are, you know, on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. But in conversations, I think there is room for some sort of compromise policies to come out of any rent control discussion. So, you know, to Peter's point, I think there is room to have those negotiation, so to speak. I think what would have been ideal was to have had those conversations before we had a Proposition 10, right? Because now we may have those conversations in a post-Costa-Hawkins world in San Francisco, and we may come to a sensible solution. There's no guarantee that that same solution is going to take place in every single city that now has the much greater options with rent control that they're going to come up with a reasonable policy. So what I keep hearing is that, absent these two choices, which is on one hand maintaining a status quo Costa-Hawkins, which very clearly is not working for many individuals. And you pointed out some of the statistics earlier. There's 1.7 million California renters who pay more than 50% of their income on rent. And clearly, that's not working for many people, right? On the other hand, we have the choice of fully repealing Costa-Hawkins, which could have some very serious consequences of actually stopping the actual supply of new housing, which in our view is the long-term, not short-term, obviously it takes a long time, it's the long-term solution to the broader housing affordability crisis. So we don't like to couch this discussion in terms of these two extremes. The idea is rent control in California is not going away. How can we have a discussion that is balanced and is nuanced that can actually work the best in California?
It sounds like vacancy control, at least in this space, vacancy control is a bit of a third rail. Have you found that in the conversations that you've had with stakeholders?
Well, it depends on which stakeholder you talk to, right? I think the Proposition 10 camp really wants vacancy control. I think that's one of the pillars of their arguments. On the other hand, a lot of the individuals on, say, the real estate side, the property owner side, vacancy control is probably one of the least, I think, desired outcomes from a Costa-Hawkins repeal.
Whereas single-family home, rent control on single-family homes and rent control on buildings constructed, post whatever the year is, which actually varies from city to city. In San Francisco, it's 1979. It's a different year in other cities. In 1995 is the full cutoff.
Yeah.
Rent control on those buildings, more recently constructed, those two, we'll say, aspects of a Costa-Hawkins repeal, those are more palatable to these various stakeholders, you find?
Yeah, so I would agree with that, and I'll take a step back and kind of give an overview of how Terner Center got involved in this conversation. Is while we were having the discussions and we weren't sure if Costa-Hawkins repeal was going to be on the ballot, we were really interested in kind of developing what are some third wave policies that would give stakeholders a better choice in this debate rather than the two that we're having now. So as part of that idea formulation was coming up with these different policies that could be palatable across different stakeholder groups. And part of that discussion included including single-family homes, having some sort of rolling inclusion, having, say, a broad rent cap that extends to every single tenant in California. And I was fairly surprised how much common ground there was between a lot of these different stakeholder groups when discussing these different options. So it's my hope that moving forward, the discussion doesn't stop after November, right?
Right.
So on one hand, we may not have Costa-Hawkins anymore, and now cities have the opportunity to decide how they want to expand rent control if they'd like to do that. And those are going to be a whole other battles and conversations, and it's going to be important that we base those decisions on a collaborative effort. On the other hand, if Costa-Hawkins doesn't get repealed, all of the issues facing tenants at risk of displacement doesn't go away.
Right.
And so hopefully, with the fight behind everyone, there can be a consensus on actual reform moving forward. So, those are kind of the two ways that we're looking at it.
I want to open up for questions soon, not just yet. I love that. Pen shoots right up. But we've got about 10 minutes before we do that, and so I think this is a great opportunity for us to give the mics to Peter and to Deepa, and they can talk about this. I make a humble request that we talk about what are the sticking points and how could we resolve them if the goal is to figure out how to come together on applying rent control to buildings constructed since 1979 in San Francisco. What are the deal breakers? What are the places where we can negotiate? Because that happens to be something that I know a little bit more about, so I can be more of a referee if necessary. There you go, guys.
First, I'd like to address some of the things that that you said. So, first of all, if the conversation is about like having the biggest conversation and the most choices, then the conversation should be about repeal. Costa-Hawkins limits the conversation we can have. It limits the options we have locally in terms of coming up with a solution that works. So, I just wanted to be very clear about that. Repeal of Costa-Hawkins does not mandate any changes. All it does is give us the chance to make that decision locally, which is where the problem is, which is where the crisis is. Just a little bit of historical context. Costa-Hawkins was an industry-sponsored bill. It was sponsored by the real estate industry, the Realtors Association and the Apartment Association in order to protect the profits. And they went to the state level because they couldn't do that at the local level because communities like San Francisco, the tenants and progressive homeowners cared too much about protecting folks here.
But a Democratic legislature passed it.
Democratic legislature passed it, but at this point the Democratic Party endorses repeal. So I just want to be clear about that too. The other thing is we don't agree with the argument that we don't agree with the assertion that Prop 10 would reduce supply. And I'd love to get into that too, but I guess I need to get to your conversation.
Well, I'd love it if you would. But,
sure.
But you're right. It's a problematic statement that I think generalizes the point of being redundant.
Right. So, no rent control jurisdiction. The reason why we think that the argument that it's going to reduce supply is wrong is, first of all, the Legislative Analyst's Office said that it's not going to have that impact, and that's not a tenant group, that's a neutral body. In addition, for it to have any impact on supply at all, it has to touch buildings being built right now, or buildings being planned in the future. And no rent control jurisdiction in the entire country has ever had rent control for buildings being built in the future. It's always had some sort of period of time where buildings were exempt.
Sorry for your Well, I got to respond to what you're saying.
I've talked to sources in real estate development, I've talked to landlords, I've talked to landlord groups, and what they've told me is that we don't know what's going to happen. If we throw rent control onto buildings that have been constructed since 1979, we throw it onto future construction, then it's unclear whether it's going to actually slow down construction in any place where that happens. The thing is, we don't know. That's the problem. We don't know. Now, depending on how you craft a rent control law that would apply to new construction or soon to come construction, you can imagine that it will have, varying degrees of slowdown impact on local real estate development. I think, this is me personally from my reporting, from the people I've talked to, I think that it is reductive to say that it would have no impact, and it's reductive to say that it would have a huge impact everywhere. It's impossible to generalize because housing markets are diverse and themselves made up of submarkets. And if you'd like to respond to that, Deepa, feel free. But I would like to move on to discussing how we could possibly get rent control onto buildings constructed since 1979 in a way that hopefully landlords and tenants can agree with.
Berkeley came up with a solution which should show the folks who are worried about this that people are willing to come to the table and work something out. Berkeley historically had some of the strongest rent control in the entire country, and definitely some of the strongest rent control in California. And advocates there decided to do a rolling date, which is what your article was about, which is a very interesting idea. And so we should look to that, and instead of being afraid of what might happen if Costa-Hawkins gets repealed, take heart that even the folks who are afraid about this should realize that even in the most progressive, most pro-rent control areas, people came up with a solution like that.
Well, I'm of course against that concept.
Which one specifically, Peter?
Well, specifically that we should have rental rates that are not market-based. These will ultimately lead to no end of problems. When you tinker with the market, you get into all kinds of trouble. You have people who won't move out of their rent control units. because they're cheap. You have even this city. I was talking about city policy earlier. I wanted to. The city has. I made the comment that government employees for the city should not benefit from rent control. There should be a means testing, and clearly the city of San Francisco shouldn't admit that it's paying salaries that are so dismal with $11.1 billion budget that the employees have to have rent control, take funding away from the benefits of an investor. Now, the rental housing is an investment. It is not a social project. And the more you get away from the market forces, the more trouble you get into. I have said earlier that if you had rent control and can eventually, after 5 or 7 years, get back to the market, that might be a discussion, a way to have some kind of rent control so that when somebody rents, for the first 3 or 4 years, they don't have a shock of a big jump in rent. But ultimately, the investor has to get back to market rates or you don't have people in this game. It's not a social project.
So Deepa, I'm sorry, Peter, Deepa has just said that she's at least intrigued, not interested in the idea of applying rent control on a rolling basis, right, to buildings as they age to a certain level. This is what I wrote about. And it sounds like you're saying you want means testing on tenants of rent control buildings. Is that what would make it negotiable for you?
Well, we have to see exactly what proposals are out there. You know, we had the 2 to 4 unit buildings were exempted until Proposition I was passed in 1994. So the Feinstein initial bill recognized that you did not want to tinker with the mom and pop rental outfits, the places this young lady pointed out that 2 or 3 family members are paying the mortgage on a house, and they're a lot of them, of course, in my organization are immigrant Chinese doing this, and it's quite impressive to see what they do for a family to buy a home in San Francisco. It's very impressive, and so I think that the point I would make is that New York has shied away from all of these programs. You only have 2% of New Yorkers are under rent control. Another block of people are under what is called rent stabilization. I had, of course, rentals in New York before I came to San Francisco. We didn't have any of these problems. There is a stability where you could, your new contract would have a maximum of 2.75% rent, but it was only for 2 years, and then you could have other increases. So when you shy totally away from market forces and think you're going to come out on top, you won't.
It actually seems like there isn't much room for negotiation in that case, right? That's what I'm hearing. Peter.
Well, we can talk, as I said. I think that
would means testing put you
in other words, we already have 16 or 17,000 units off the market in the regular thing. And then what I wanted to point out on this, I'm going to I'll be quick, but I want to digress just a second. It is rent control.
Really quick.
Illegal units are under rent control. Whether they're legal or not, they have to comply with all rent regulations. So, of course, David Chu passed this ordinance 4314, and I gave him my advice. He didn't listen to me. The regulation was passed that you have to legalize your unit at an average cost of $175,000 so far, and you have 40,000 units in this category. So what is that? And if you're sued if a tenant sues you and you have an illegal unit, you have to give all the rent you paid. You have to give it back to the tenant, you know. That's where these scammers come in. They go from place to place, bring a lawsuit against you, and then they get all their rent repaid. So the fact of the matter is, more units have been taken off the market illegal units. People are abandoning them. I only have anecdotal information, but we did a survey walking up and down the street in the Sunset. Many, many, many more people are just getting rid of their tenants, hopefully through natural attrition. People move out, and they're not renting it because they're scared to death. You're going to be sued, and you have to give all the rent you've ever paid back to the tenant, and you have to legalize your, and the tenant can live in that place because it's illegal without paying rent for life. Government policies are crippling this city.
I hope what the audience takes away from this is that this is a very, very tense discussion. It's going to be between here and November. And we're hoping that we can resolve it. May the record show that these two did agree on the potential of applying rent control to single-family homes and also for buildings constructed past 1979.
Well, sort of.
Exactly, right? Real quick question for David, and then we're going to go to questions. David, how do we get through this? How do we get out of the woods on Costa-Hawkins and rent control?
Wow. You want me to answer that quickly?
When you're talking, whether it's in public or in conversations in private, off the record, with developers, with lenders, investors, all the people that we've talked about, with advocates, what seems to click? What seems to cut through all of the noise and get to some place where people start to talk to each other and agree about the way forward on this specific topic?
That's a really great question. First, I want to commend you for trying to broker the deal right here on stage. I was hoping we would get there. But
by degrees.
But I think you hit the nail on the head earlier. This is such a intense personal discussion because I think we all know people who are affected by the housing crisis. In fact, a lot of people maybe here are affected by it personally. So it's hard to have the conversation, I think, in public, and I think that's why you have a lot of the high-level stakeholders, maybe hinting they're okay with the compromise. And I want to preface, I haven't spoken to every single stakeholder, so I have a select group of individuals that we spoke to for our brief that we released in May. But I think once you start talking about a lot of these policies in terms of what's the broader goal here? Is the goal specifically to get a better or broader rent control? If so, that's a different conversation than speaking broadly about the housing crisis in general. So the creation of more housing or creation of deed-restricted below-market rate housing. So I think by expanding the scope of that discussion really starts getting people to the table and understanding, I understand why you favor this policy, here's how that affects, the supply of housing, or the effect.
That's not just about Prop 10.
Right, and then also in expanding the conversation of just rent control, because there's a whole host of other tenant protection policies that we haven't touched on. I think we touched on briefly in the previous panel that need to be part of the conversation as well.
Like eviction protections.
So eviction protections. We haven't even talked about the Ellis Act. So there's all of these other factors that go far beyond just the idea of whether Costa-Hawkins is good or bad. And once you kind of again broaden the scope of the conversation, you start to come up with more consensus around broader issues. So, obviously this is not going, there's going to be no consensus going until November because we have composition, we have campaigns now. But again, moving forward, I'm hoping that perhaps some of the work that Terner Center did can be the basis of those conversations to say, okay, well, what is the reasonable amount of time to that should pass before new construction falls under rent control. I think if you haven't read his article, I think Noah did a really fantastic job breaking down the all the sides of that argument, because there is no consensus. I think you're absolutely right. It is not. You can't say it will have no effect or it will be disastrous. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And we didn't do that financial analysis to say, okay, well, Costa-Hawkins repeal X number of units won't be built. There's no real way to know that, but there will be some impact. And I think to the extent that the solution to the broader housing crisis is to create more housing of all kinds in all places, there needs to be an understanding of what the repeal of Costa-Hawkins could mean in that context.
Thank you, guys. Let's go to questions.
So the question is, if you are press, San Francisco press doing investigatory interviews, can you interview all communities, not just one side? Because right now you focus on tenants and money.
Believe it or not, I've got it to do on my phone to call up you, Ellen, and have a conversation with you about people you represent. Because I've got questions about what you're saying. And we'll see what happens.
Okay, and so this woman here, yes, and this gentleman here, is that you?
Here's what I want to bring up. We can't have a panel that is not evidence-based. You cannot come up, sir, and tell us what you feel, what you believe, without any data. This lady here, Helen, talks about Hong Kong. This is the most preposterous thing. This is one of the most expensive real estate market in the world. All I'm expecting from people that are presenting there is evidence-based data and solutions. We have the most progressive rent control. Here's my question. We have the most progressive rent control data city, that is the city of Berkeley before Costa-Hawkins. We've had years, decades of that. Why can't you go and look at that in comparison to the rate of housing production up until Costa-Hawkins? We can't put the two and two together and say, no, we cannot fear that. There are comparisons between Berkeley and the neighboring community with no rent control, such as Oakland, and say, did that slow down the rate of housing production?
Right. Let me respond.
Thank you.
There is data. The data is generally not clean. The data is generally not consistent from one jurisdiction to the next. It doesn't mean it can't be analyzed. It is a lot of work, and that's why I'm really hoping that everybody in this room is going to become a member, because we want to do more of the kind of work that we've done tonight. We want to convene more of these, have more of these conversations, and that addition over there took a lot of work. We want to do more of that, and that would include the kind of work that you're describing. Yes, it is possible.
So Noah, can I jump in here?
Yes.
And add on something to that. So that's a really great point, and it's a point of frustration that we've seen, is that the research on rent control in California is not as robust as it should be, and it makes it harder to make these decisions. There is some research on exactly what you referred to was, you know, the cities that had more restrictive rent control policies before Costa-Hawkins. So the studies that I have seen there, and then we've referenced in the report, do show that the rate of growth in those cities relative to cities that were directly adjacent, that had similar housing markets but did not have restrictive rent control, actually those cities had lower rates of building. That being said, I think every rent control policy is very different. So rent control varies broadly depending on
the housing markets, the rent control policies in it.
Exactly. So they're not all the same. So it's very difficult to draw comparisons. So and I want to also draw another point, is that in our brief that we put out, we looked at some of these some of the data out there, but from both sides, right? From the supply side, but also from the point of view at rent control can actually be quite beneficial for tenants in the form of savings over time in rent and stability. So I think, depending on the report you read and your position, you can find research and data that supports your position on rent control. The idea is aggregating it all and being willing to understand all of the arguments around it, because rent control, it's a very complex issue, as you can see.
Could San Francisco do that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're actually, Prop C is trying to do just that, tax in order to build low-income housing. Because right now there's no money to do that. There's not enough money to actually build those units. And so I think we completely agree that we need to have other ways, we need more ways to build affordable units. And one of those ways needs to be, we believe, that public land, when there is public, there's so little land that we have access to in this city. When we do have access to land, when the city owns the land, when the school board owns the land, or whatnot, that land should be used for affordable housing, because it's just too expensive to try to buy units to build on the market without taking advantage of the opportunities we have.
So just to piggyback on top of that, I think that goes to the discussion of broadening this scope of the housing crisis and creating more deed-restricted affordable housing. And so that was part of what we looked at in our rent control brief was how can you use tax policy to actually incentivize the creation of deed-restricted below market rate housing. We actually propose a similar model that you find in Seattle, where developers get property tax breaks if they include a certain level of affordability on site. It's created almost 8,000 units in less than 10 years in Seattle. But I think the idea of broadening the conversation of how do we use tax policy or other means to actually build more affordable housing that is deed restricted, so it's means tested, needs to be just as much a part of the conversation.
Should I?
Can I add to this? I'm a disciple of Adam Smith and the free market, as you may have gathered, and you're not going to be able to buy land. First of all, the Constitution prohibits using public money for private purposes, and so you'd have to work around that issue. You can do it, but it's rather complex. But you'll never solve the housing problem, the housing shortage. Remember, the crisis I define as a housing shortage. It's true there is an affordability factor, but that comes down when you have more units to rent. And you must find a way to incentivize the private sector to build these units, build below market units. You won't make it through all these government policies.
Here's the thing about that, though, Peter. What I've heard, and then I want to move on to somebody else who's not me.
Evidence-based.
What I've heard is that it's not as simple as just building housing into the market and that lowers prices. There are submarkets, right? So there's luxury housing, right? There's middle-income housing, there's low-income housing. You're not going to have the same clientele, so to speak, the same consumer for each of those submarkets, right? So housing in Ingleside in San Francisco is not the same thing as housing in Nob Hill, and they're going to have different consumers going after them. So if you just build in a general sense, it's being somewhat insensitive to the nuances of the market. That's all. I wanted to throw an asterisk on that.
So, I will say,
I agree.
I would say we don't have to choose, right? Because it is definitely true that there are sections of the market that private for-profit developers will never reach, and that's always been true. And so to the extent that we can provide the funding to build out affordable housing is just as much as part, if not more of the solution, than just building broad.
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things. First of all, most of the affordable units in San Francisco, by far, are rent controlled. Many rent control units are much cheaper, and the people living in them are lower income and don't even qualify for below market rate units if they get evicted. It's so difficult for us to build, and it's so expensive for us to build new affordable units, that rent control and expanding rent control also needs to be part of the solution, and that's why we're so focused on it. We are not at all against building affordable housing. We absolutely promote it. It's part of our mission, and it's why we're so excited about Prop C this year and about Prop 1. But rent control is a huge part of the solution.
Okay, you, sir.
Thank you. I have a little bit of info, but I do have a question. Thank you. I think sometimes we get too constrained by what we've seen locally. So just take us somewhere else for a bit. In Germany, there is rent control nationally. All rental housing is under rent control. There's no limitation on housing built before 1979, because that's when San Francisco was in rent control. There's no limitation on single-family housing, and there is vacancy control as well. When you as a landlord and your tenant leaves, you're limited as to the rent that you can charge. And yet, landlords continue to own and rent rental property of all types in Germany. Developers continue to build apartment blocks for tenants to move into in Germany. And Germany recently brought in a limit, an extra limit on this, because in some of their housing markets they were seeing that even those controls were still not enough to prevent the eviction of people. Now their rent control is not the same percentages as ours, but I just want to raise that. It is possible to do something that works and has worked for a long time. And then the question is, I'll say, I'm a tenant here in San Francisco, but I'm also a landlord. I'm a landlord because I own property elsewhere, small landlord, like a lot of the people here in the audience. But I accept that my right to make a profit and to make money off the property that I own. It's important. I don't want that taken away from me, but it doesn't trump the right of a tenant who is paying a reasonable rent to be able to live in their house. I don't have the right to evict that person, and I don't have the right to create an environment in which people cannot get housing. And the question is to Peter or anybody else on the panel, do you feel your property rights override that right of somebody to be able to get a place to live and stay in that place?
No, I started out by saying that if you have vacancy control and you can never get back to market reasonable rate, you'll have a lot of problems. But I have no problems with, for 5 or 7 years, having a person increase the rent at CPI or 60% of CPI. I think it's kind of wrong to be 60% of CPI, but I won't argue that. But eventually you have to get back to market rate. One other thing you mentioned, Germany. The Swedish model is one you ought to look up on the internet. They have a number of articles there. 605,000 units short in Stockholm. They have rent control, vacancy control, and the payments under the table reach as high as $100,000. And the government decides who gets those units. Wow, that sounds like something that we don't want here.
Yes, we do.
This question for you, Peter. If you could tell us exactly what would be unfair about limits on rent increases for non-rent controlled units of, say, somewhere between 10 and 20%. What's unfair about that?
Oh, 10 or 20% sounds really great.
I guess I have a follow-up to that. How do you feel then about the proposal in the Terner Center report of a statewide limit on price gouging at the sort of 10%, 5 to 10% level?
Oh, well, that's of course in emergencies, and we have that now.
I think, well, so there's that, but I think
That's what it's based on.
it's based on that, but there was a suggestion in that report as part of their third way compromise of having a statewide limit on rent increases that were more than 10%. So you said it sounds really great. Would you feel like that would be unfair at a state level to limit all rent increases that are more than 10%?
Well, during the 70s, I mean, and this is non-political, but to frame it for you, time when Carter was president, we had the inflation up to 17%. Well, if it came back to that, I think you'd have to discuss the 10%. But basically, what you're proposing is something we can only dream about in this city. 10% increase? Good Lord! We would love to have that.
I think the suggestion was just on top of the rent increase. I mean, so
just to clarify, so what we looked at in part of our brief was modeled after existing law on disaster declarations. So if the governor declares a state of emergency, they have an anti-gouging cap of 10%, where all goods, not just housing, can't rise above that to prevent gouging. So our proposal was to create a permanent cap that was not 10% strictly, but was 5% plus CPI. So you have some variations. So it was more like 8-7%. That if enacted statewide could guard against the most egregious forms of price increases that are designed really to get the tenant out of the unit. One point of clarification is that this was not, say, an endorsement of rent increases up to 10%. It was really a floor. So to provide baseline levels of protections for all renters in California, regardless of if they have rent control today, because there are the majority of cities in California will probably not adopt rent control themselves. And this state level cap would provide that base level of protection. And in our conversations with stakeholders, that 10% number, pretty much everyone was fine with that. As a general business practice, you're not raising the rent 10%. You're raising it to what the market can bear, and unless you are acting nefariously and you are trying to flip the property and evict individuals. That's where this anti-gouging cap would provide a level of protection that is not available today.
So Jesus who's our wonderful host here at the Impact Hub, said we can take a couple more questions. So we haven't heard from you, ma'am, so go ahead.
As a parent, you would punish your child for doing something wrong. Yes. Right?
So can you...
But if you encourage your child to do something, you will incentivize. So if you want owners to rent out your place, you want to incentivize them, not punish them. The more you punish them, the less they will want to rent out. Right? That's everything started when the market rate and the rent control gap started widening.
Can I ask if there's a question for the panel?
So the question is, how do you incentivize people to rent out that 17,000 or 30,000 units instead of punishing them? The more you punish, the less they want to rent. That is the given. How do you incentivize them?
How do you incentivize renting out a $17,000 a month
vacant unit?
No, the 17,000 vacant units.
Well, there was the idea of the vacancy tax was in your paper.
That's punishment. That's punishment. You need
regulation is sometimes necessary to make sure people get their basic needs met. I mean, we've seen that in a whole host of categories of government regulation. That's what regulation is for, is to make sure that we have a society that works. It sounds like landlords still rent in Germany. Thank you for that point, and I'd love to talk to you more about that. So rather than looking at this as punishment, we're talking about creating reasonable incentives so that people aren't rewarded for greed. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have two really quick questions. And forgive me if I'm a little bit ignorant with this issue, because I'm trying to learn it. First one for Deepa. I have a cushy tech job, and that doesn't sleep for 10 years. Why should I be protected under rent control when my coworkers in just moved to the city are getting killed? And they're often paying like twice as much as what I'm paying. And the second question is for Peter. What is your opposition against vacancy control? If I understand correctly, I think homeowners are also protected under Prop 13 as well for property tax.
Do we need those questions restated for anyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you start?
Sure. The question for me is, why should sorry, I didn't get your name, be protected under rent control as somebody who has a decent, cushy tech job? So I would say the same reason why you should have access to the bus system and the public parks, and that your kids should be able to go to public school. The thing about means testing, and the reason why we don't believe in means testing for rent control at the San Francisco Tenants Union is because to create a means testing system incentivizes discrimination against the poor by the landlords themselves. And it also means that the middle class won't be invested in the program. We all know what happened to public housing. We've seen cuts that have gotten deeper and deeper and deeper at the federal level, at the state level, and even at the local level in terms of the amount we invest in services that are for the poor, specifically housing for the poor. And a program that covers the middle class as well, a program that the middle class is invested in, is a program that's popular and a program that lasts. It means that our systems work, it means that the regulations work, it means that the rent board works, and that's just not true for public housing. So in order to have a solution that works for middle income people as well, it needs to, it works better for low income people, and it includes middle income people too.
What was your question?
Oh, the second question was about vacancy control and your opposition against it, and how does that square with homeowners being protected under Prop 13?
Oh, Prop 13. Well,
could you restate the question for everyone, please?
He wants to know why I'm against the vacancy control, and yet I'm quite willing to take Prop 13 benefits. Well, there's an interesting thing on that. First of all, I was against Prop 13 because what I really like to have ideally in life is a responsible government, a responsible board of supervisors that watches their money when they spend. We have $11.1 billion budget and about almost $8 billion. The city admits to $6.8 billion in salaries. But there are other costs, so it turns out they just squander money like crazy. We have 5 times as many people working for the city as Philadelphia does, and it's a city of 2 million. Now on Prop 13, I said ideally we shouldn't have that. You are correct, but there's an interesting thing on that where I can get you. A recent study just came out, and I can probably find it again, that rents are kept lower. In other words, if I have a house, let's say my house, and I'm paying $14,000 a year tax, and my neighbor's paying $2,000 for a similar house, and they rent theirs, they don't have to have as much income. The study shows that it's not a great amount of money, but renters benefit from Prop 13 as much as property owners, not as much as property owners, but they benefit some, which is curious. Yeah, I'll try and find it.
Could you talk about vacancy control?
But that's vacancy control.
Well, vacancy control, I mean, I've already talked about that. If you have somebody who's earning, who has been a tenant for 15 years and they're paying 40% of market, and then you're supposed to rent to a new person at 40% of market, who's going to stay in the rental business? Nobody's going to stay in that. This is, these programs are, rental housing is an investment. And now I wanted just to pick on my neighbor here next door. In terms of public housing, you know, the city only had 4,600 units of public housing. That's the most they ever had. And they bungled the management of them so badly, they turned them over to Mercy Housing and to the Tenants Union and so on. The cities can't run public housing. They're lousy all over the world.
I'm not sure if that's entirely true. One of the reasons might be that it's been disinvested in real dollars ever since the 1970s. And so maybe it's not so surprising that that housing started falling apart and that the management got worse and worse as the portfolios got, the number of people working on those portfolios, it was completely beyond capacity for anyone to handle. And again, this is why means-tested programs are politically at risk in a society where people care about themselves. So, in terms of Prop 13, I just want to say one of the arguments for passing it was because property owners said that they were going to lower the rents, they were going to pass the savings on to tenants. And to my understanding, that did not happen. So if there's a study to the contrary, I'd love to see it, so please send it my way.
People, it was passed because people were getting taxed out. People my age were getting taxed out of their homes because they were raising the taxes every year. That's right.
But what's the difference between that and a vacancy control?
Okay, so one last thing I'd like to say about that is we believe in stable, affordable housing for everyone, and that includes homeowners too. And that's why we support a split roll. So thanks for bringing that up.
No, I think you have the topic of your next issue, Prop 13 reform.
We hope you enjoy this issue. We're here to celebrate all the hard work of our editorial team for issue 25. We've been around for almost 10 years, and we're a nonprofit. And if you would like Noah was saying, I love your plugs, Noah. Like Noah was saying, if you want to see more of these events and you want to have more of our reporting, please follow us. Please sign up for our newsletter. We have two upcoming events. One is on the 6th, it's our public meeting. Our next public event is our public meeting, which for 501c3s, we have one annually. So we'll have a board meeting and an open public meeting. That's on the 6th of September. And then we have a school board forum for SFUSD on September 26th. So we hope that you can join us. Please, I hope that some of our speakers are available for you to speak with. Thank you, Michael Stoll, our Executive Director, for doing all the